Egypt's former army chief of staff Sami Anan is said to have secret documents that could be released if he's threatened. With a controversial election just weeks away, how will this case be played out? And is there a rift within the army? This is Inside Story. Hello and welcome to the program. I'm Mohamed Jamjoom. Egypt has gone from one political crisis to the next since a military coup in 2013. Now, with presidential elections just weeks away, the situation appears to get worse. Last month, former Army Chief of Staff General Sami Anan announced he would stand for elections, only to be arrested some weeks later. His former aide and Egypt's once state auditor, Hesham Geneina, was arrested on Tuesday. During an interview with the Huffington Post Arabic network on Monday, Geneina had said he would release secret documents that could implicate senior government leaders if Anan is harmed in any way. Here's some of what he had to say.
I'd hoped an opportunity to be given to the Chief of Staff, Sami Anan, to give a testimony freely and without intimidation for the record, so that all things come clear before the public.
Is his testimony mere hearsay or supported with evidence?
He is in possession of documents and evidence which is not kept here in Egypt.
You mean out of Egypt?
Yes.
Could these pieces of evidence change the course of trials?
Of course, no doubt.
Could they incriminate many?
Yes.
Geneina also spoke of what he said was an assassination attempt against Egypt's former vice president and longtime spy chief, Omar Suleiman. In 2012, the Egyptian government said Suleiman died in the U.S. from health problems, but some have questioned that statement.
The assassination attempt on Omar Suleiman has not been revealed. Are we told who was behind the attempt?
These are the facts that Anan knows?
Among the facts that need to be brought to light.
The Egyptian army fired back, saying Geneina's allegations amount to crimes aimed at casting doubt at the state's credibility and its institutions at a time its forces are fighting in Sinai to root out what it calls terrorism. It went on to say, the armed forces will use all the rights it is guaranteed by the Constitution to protect national security and preserve its honor and dignity. The investigation will be referred to the relevant legislative bodies who will be taking legal action against both defendants. Let's take a closer look at this case. Retired General Sami Anan announced he would run for president last month. With his military background, many saw him as a strong challenger to President Fattah AlSissi. But 2 weeks later, the army arrested him, accusing him of not receiving proper permission to run and forging documents. His campaign was suspended indefinitely. Shortly after Anan's arrest, his aide and former state auditor Hesham Geneina was seriously injured in a suspected kidnapping attempt in Cairo. The Interior Ministry said Geneina was hurt during a dispute over a car accident. Let's bring in our guests. Joining us on Skype from Cairo, Timothy Kaldas, non-resident fellow at the Tahrir Institute for Middle East Policy. In London, Wafiq Mustafa, founder and chairman of the British Arab Network and author of Egypt, The Elusive Arab Spring. And in Zurich, also on Skype, Majid Mandoor, political analyst and columnist of Chronicles of the Arab Revolt on Open Democracy. Thank you all for joining us. Timothy, let me start with you. Just how serious do you think these threats by Mr. Geneina are?
I mean, I have reason to believe that they really probably do have something with respect to the regime. I think realistically, given Anan's position as the chief of the armed forces, he was privy to a lot of what went on, and I mean, we know that many crimes were committed. So it's a matter of who has evidence to support the information. And so there's really no reason not to believe that evidence exists somewhere. It would also help explain why Anan took the risk of running when he clearly didn't have enough internal support within the regime to guarantee his ability to stay out of prison. So perhaps he feels that this is going to was something that would have protected him. And it remains to be seen if that's actually the case.
Wafiq, do you have any idea of what kind of secret documents that Mr. Geneina may be referring to and who possibly they could implicate?
Firstly, I would say that Geneina is probably one of the most credible civil servants in Egypt, and he uncovered billions of dollars disappearing into secret accounts. I think he must know something, because this man have got a huge credibility, and he doesn't say anything which really doesn't have basis for it. And as well, he was one of the top assistants for General Anan. And General Anan, no doubt, knows a lot what was going on, particularly during the uprising 2011, what the army was passing, some thugs and some security people masquerading as citizens to destroy the uprising, and as well snipers from the top of the buildings. He knows very well, and he can implicate some senior generals who are alive and probably very active in running Egypt at the moment.
Majid, Egyptian media is now reporting that Sami Anan's lawyer and son are denying these claims by Mr. Geneina. Any idea why?
Well, it's really very hard to tell, but they might be subjected to pressures. I mean, in the end, we don't know what they have, and it's also kind of important to consider that the crimes committed were a matter of systematic policy. So I don't know how he can actually divulge this information without implicating himself. So that's also kind of an open point for me. I don't know what he knows, but at this moment, the situation is very fluid and it's very hard to tell. He knows something, but what he knows and to which extent is he actually able to reveal without actually implicating himself remains an open point.
Timothy, Hesham Geneina's family is now saying that he has been detained, that he has been arrested since making these remarks. So if that's the case, does that lend credence, does that lend validity to the idea that the army or that President AlSissi in Egypt, that they are concerned about these documents and that these documents actually exist?
Well, I mean, they're in a kind of a catch-22 position right now, and also I don't think Geneina played his hand very intelligently. I don't doubt that he's a well-intentioned individual, but the problem is if you do have documents implicating the top members of the regime and that can demonstrate that they've committed some sort of crime, the value in the threat is in doing it privately. If you say publicly that I have documents proving that you're a terrible person, and if you don't do X, Y, and Z, I'm going to release them, and then they do X, Y, and Z without touching Geneina, then in effect they're conceding that the documents are real and that they are in fact terrible people or whatever, or war criminals, or they violate human rights or whatever the crimes delineating the documents would show. So if they leave them alone, they're actually kind of also conceding that the documents may have credence. I don't understand his thinking in terms of saying this publicly. It would have made a lot more sense to threaten that privately.
Wafiq, in that interview, Hesham Geneina talks about the third party, and he mentions invisible fingers that guided events during Egypt's revolution. Who exactly is he referring to? Many in Egypt believe that that's potentially a reference to military intelligence at a time when Abdel Fattah AlSissi was leading that institution. What do you say to that?
I think putting pieces together, it points to General Sisi personally and his closest advisors. I think it's a very damning issue. Particularly, the pieces are coming now that the military, particularly military intelligence and general intelligence, have worked extremely hard to undermine the uprising in many ways, using propaganda and using very hard and very cruel tactics like shooting at people, killing people. Virtually, snipers were blowing the brains off people. I think it should be exposed, and I think the papers, we should actually see these people released to speak to us openly. General Geneina, Master Geneina, our General Sami Anan, they should be released and should not be mistreated, because they obviously, their house been ransacked, the family of General Sami Anan been detained, and that says a lot of things that Sisi panicked.
Majid, Sami Anan, of course, has been in the news a lot this past month. I mean, he was seen as a potentially very viable threat to Abdel Fattah AlSissi in the presidential elections. Here's a former military man that's said to have broad support amongst some members high up in the military in Egypt. But the fact of the matter is, his candidacy was derailed. He's been detained. Where do things stand for Sami Anan right now, especially in light of what Hesham Geneina is saying?
Well, it's very difficult at the moment because if they release him, then there will be a lot of questions about the documents now and what does he know. So this is very unusual, I would say. So his future is very vague, and it's very difficult now to deal with him. And I think he has no choice but to actually deny this and to reach some sort of an agreement. Because he does not have the support within the military that would actually lend him the power to be able to get himself out of this predicament.
Okay, building on what Majid said, Timothy, I want to ask you, the fact that Sami Anan seemed to have so much substantial support amongst some military men, top-tier military men in Egypt, and was seen by some to be a potential threat to the candidacy of Abdel Fattah AlSissi. Did that mean that President Sisi may have been losing important support in his presidential bid? And does that also point to a potential rift or schism within the armed forces in Egypt?
Well, I think that given how swiftly and decisively they handled Sami Anan's announcement for running for president, some of the talk about schisms within the armed forces and how dramatic they are may be wishful thinking, right? It might be the case that while there are some people that aren't terribly pleased with Sisi, they might like Anan to go to the point where they would actually support like a change and like bringing things to a head publicly. I don't think that there was that many high-ranking people who were for that, and how things have gone kind of indicate that's the case, which is I think also a signal that they're hoping to send by being so flagrant in the way that they're handling this election and not really allowing for any serious dialogue. But the threat that Anan posed wasn't that he was going to become president of Egypt. That's not a realistic prospect. The threat that Anan posed was that having somebody of his stature, former chief of the armed forces, spend 2 months criticizing both Sisi and the role of the institution of the military in politics, which he did in his campaign announcement, that could do a lot of damage to the standing of both Sisi and the military as a whole. I mean, he really went for the third rail, which is to criticize the role of the institution of the military and government. That's even riskier than criticizing Sisi himself. And so by going that far and the prospect of him doing that for months in lead up to the election, that for me is probably the biggest threat that he posed and why they decided that they needed to lock him up.
Wafiq, I want to talk also about the intelligence services in Egypt. You have military intelligence, you also have general intelligence. Now, President Sisi, he was formerly in charge of military intelligence. Recently, he replaced Khalid Fawzi, who had led general intelligence since December 2014, with Abbas Kamel, who's close to Sisi and who's a retired army general. So what does that say to you about the state of affairs in the intelligence services and about any potential rivalries between the different branches?
There has always been rivalry between the military intelligence and general intelligence, bearing in mind that both of them are military controlled and controlled by generals from the military. But certainly general intelligence were not supporting Sisi. That's why he rushed and put his head of office as interim head of general intelligence last few weeks. I think there is some turbulence in the military establishment. Obviously, there is a problem because I think General Anan have sensed the huge discontent among the public. That's why he appealed to the public, he appealed to civilians, he appealed to civil movements and Egypt to get out of the military rule. That's why he probably angered some military ranks by siding with the public, which I think was a very clever thing, although he paid price for it. And I think it's very important to make sure that Annan is not being hurt. I think there should be pressure from the major powers on Sisi to make sure this man is released and is not being badly treated or mistreated in prison. And he should not be in prison to start with, he or Geneina or anybody else, because there's so many people in prison.
Majid, building on what Wafiq said there, do you think that there will be pressure put on President Sisi, on the Egyptian government, by allies of Egypt to release these former candidates? Because U.S. Secretary of State Rex Tillerson was just in Cairo, and we didn't hear any concerns publicly from him about the state of affairs in Egypt when it comes to jailing political opponents, imprisoning journalists, human rights workers, anything like that.
I don't really see this happening. I would be very surprised if there is international pressure. As you well know, the human rights records of the regime is absolutely horrendous. So Anan is not the first, and he won't be the last. And human rights now is especially related to the Middle East is not a decisive factor in determining Western foreign policy. So I would be extremely shocked if there is any form of international pressure. No, I don't see this happening, actually.
Timothy, with these looming presidential elections next month that more and more critics and observers are calling an outright farce and saying that this is not going to be democratic or free or fair in any way, what is the Egyptian public, what are they saying about it? What is their sentiment towards these elections? Do they believe that these will be carried out in a correct way, in a fair and free manner?
No, of course not. I mean, everybody knows it's a sham. I think that the Egyptian public knew that before it started, right? The world is coming to see that as well. But I mean, nobody really thought that Sisi was going to actually, that his second term was in any sort of peril. That was never something that the vast majority of Egyptians ever believed. I mean, the government has gone out of its way to make it very clear that there will be no real election come March. But even before they had done anything, there weren't a lot of people suspecting a serious competition, and they had little reason to expect such a thing, given the repression that we've seen for years. So no, I mean, it's a foregone conclusion. The question is, what will the regime do to up turnout so that it's not too embarrassing? But beyond that, I mean, they made sure there was some fake candidate that would run. Somebody who was already campaigning for Sisi is now running against him. But beyond that, they've removed everybody from the election, basically.
Wafiq, at this point, you essentially only have one other candidate running against President AlSissi. You have a very obscure politician named Mustafa Musa. Why even allow him to run at this point? What does Sisi have to gain by that?
It's really, I think, Sisi in a big trap, and he doesn't know what to do. And getting someone who's very not known in public, nobody ever heard his name. I met him accidentally once in Cairo about 10, 12 years ago, and he's a very lightweight, if no weight at all. I think Sisi is in a big trouble, particularly his moment came with the arrest and detention of General Anan and Geneina and their families. I think he is in a big, big trouble, and the world got to see that, because Egypt is very important. We don't want Egypt to fail as a country. We want Egypt to survive as a state. And I think this carry-on is not going to help the matters. The public in Egypt is very unhappy. The country is no transparency. There's many thousands in prisons. Intimidation on daily basis, people being killed. It's just the country cannot run this way week to week.
Majid, if Sami Anan does indeed have these incriminating documents that Hesham Geneina claims that he has, why would he not have used them by now?
Well, let's not forget that he's a military man, and he was the second in command. So it really depends on what are in those documents. As I said, it might actually implicate him himself, because this was not only kind of a one-off incident. It was a matter of systematic policy. So, and it was the military establishment. I mean, Anan is not a hero himself. He was part of this regime, and he remains a part of it. So we just have to see if those documents exist, what's in those documents, and how far is he willing to release them. This is his kind of last resort if he really has to. But since it's public now, the threat has kind of lost its potency. So we just have to see what's going to happen now.
Timothy, what's the level of public support right now in Egypt for President Sisi?
I mean, it's definitely declined since its peak in 2013, but he still enjoys a fair bit of support within the country. I mean, it's not necessarily that people love him. There's some people who do, but then there's other people who just feel like he's doing a difficult job that has to be done. I mean, I spoke to one person who said he was going to vote for him just because, despite the fact that he strongly disliked him, that he felt like the projects that he's undertaken need to be completed. I think that the question about his popularity, though, needs to be couched in its context, which is that in the public sphere, in the media, you can't really criticize him. So it's an untested popularity, which is, again, why Anan campaigning for 2 months was quite threatening. This would be an opportunity for somebody to actually criticize Sisi publicly and forcefully in a way that hadn't been the case previously. And so it could really fracture that very fragile popularity that he still maintains to some extent. Yeah, that's how I would look at his popularity.
Majid, I'm going to give you the last point here. The 7th anniversary of the Egyptian revolution has come and gone, and many people in Egypt feel that the situation is far worse now than it was even under Mubarak's rule. What are your thoughts on that, as far as where Egypt is right now under the rule of President Sisi?
Sadly, I would say that is true. Things have not improved, and it seems that the trajectory is towards a decline rather than an improvement. And it's not just in the democratic record, it is in the human rights field, it's in the political field, the security, the economy. There is massive mismanagement everywhere, and it seems that corruption has become a matter of a state policy. So sadly, I have to say that that is the case.
Well, thanks to all our guests. We're going to have to leave it there. Timothy Kaldas, Wafiq Mustafa, and Majid Mandoor. And thank you, too, for watching. You can see the program again anytime by visiting our website at aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. You can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Mohamed Jamjoom, and the entire team here, bye for now.